I had ridden into a lot of towns with nothing but trail dust and a bad temper, but the first thing Hales Crossing ever did was try to drown my horse. The Sablon was up from a storm somewhere north, brown and shouldering along faster than it looked, and the ferry that ought to have carried a man across was chained to its post on the far bank with nobody working the rope. I sat the bank a long minute, watching the water try to decide whether it wanted the road or not, and I thought about turning back the 6 miles to Camino and sleeping in a livery stall again. Then I saw the woman. She came down the far slope at a dead walk, skirts hiked in one fist, and she got the ferry loose and pulled it out into that current alone, and she did it without once looking like she doubted it would work. The river shoved at the flat deck. She leaned into the pole and rode the shove and let the rope do the arguing, and she brought that ferry across 100 feet of angry water and landed it soft against my bank like she was setting down a cup of coffee. "You'll want to lead him on slow," she said before I'd said a word. "He'll balk at the ramp. They all do the first time." I looked at her. She had a plain, worn face gone brown at the edges from weather, and a way of standing square to a thing that told you she'd stopped expecting anybody to help her carry it. She could not have been much past 30. There was river mud to her elbows and a smear of it on her jaw, and she wore it the way a soldier wears a scar, without any thought of it at all. "You run this crossing by yourself?" I said. "I run it," she said, which wasn't quite an answer, and stood aside to let me lead my horse aboard. "My name is Wade Callum, and I want to set this down plain and true while I've still got the years to do it, because a man's memory sands the corners off everything, and I don't want the corners sanded off this. I was 34 that summer, and I had been a drover most of my life, which is to say I had spent it moving other men's cattle across other men's country and owning nothing but a saddle and a grudge. My father had died 2 winters before with his boots on and his debts unpaid, and I had buried him on a rise above a river much like this one and ridden away from it the same afternoon, because there was nothing to stay for and a great deal, it turned out, to run from. Mostly what I was running from that summer was my brother. But I'll come to Levi. First there was the water and the woman, and the way the ferry rocked under us as she brought us back across, both of us braced and quiet, the pole biting and lifting, and the far bank climbing toward us out of the brown. "2 bits for a rider and horse," she said when the ramp scraped the gravel. "$1 for a wagon. Herds by the head, and I want to see them counted before they cross, not after." "You expecting a herd?" "I'm expecting whatever comes." She looped the rope and did not look at me. "It's a road, mister, things come." I paid her the 2 bits. I remember the coins going from my hand to hers, and I remember that her hand was harder than mine, which had been shamed off no man in a good while. Then I led my horse up the ramp and onto the road, and I meant to keep going, and I want that understood too. I did not ride into Hales Crossing to save anybody. I rode in to cross a river and keep moving, the way I'd been moving my whole life, and if the water had been an inch lower, I'd have crossed it and gone and never learned her name. Instead, the trace led up past a low log house with a dog trot down the middle and a garden gone brave and ragged in the heat, and a barn that wanted a new roof, and a sign nailed to a cedar post at the fork where the Camino road split off. Hales Crossing, it said, in letters somebody had carved careful a long time ago and painted over careless more than once since. And under it, newer in a different hand, a smaller board had been nailed up crooked, and that board said, "Notice of sale for debt." I don't know why I stopped. I've turned it over 1,000 times and I can't give you a reason that would satisfy a sensible man. Maybe it was the crooked board under the careful sign, the way one hand had built the thing and another hand meant to take it. Maybe I was just tired of moving. Maybe a man who has run out on everything he ever had gets to where the sight of somebody about to lose the one thing they're standing on stops his horse for him whether he wants it stopped or not. I sat there long enough that she came up the bank behind me, wiping her hands on her apron, and saw where I was looking. That's not for you to read, she said. No, ma'am. Then ride on. But I didn't ride on. And that, more than the wedding that came after, is the true beginning of it. Her name was Nora Hale, and she had been born in that log house, and she meant to die in it, and Ezra Halloran meant to see that she didn't. I learned the shape of it over the next 2 days, because I did not ride on, and I couldn't have told you why except that my horse had thrown a shoe on the Camino road, and the crossing was the nearest place with an anvil, and Nora Hale, who did not want me there, would not send a lame horse 6 miles to be shod when she had a forge of her own. So I stayed to work the shoe, and I slept in her barn with her permission grudged out a word at a time, and I kept my ears open the way a man does who has spent his life among strangers, and learned that most of what you need to know they'll tell you if you just don't ask. Her father, Amos Hale, had built the crossing 30 years before, when the road was a game trail, and the river had drowned more men than it carried. He'd strung the first rope himself and charged nothing the first year because there was nobody to charge, and by the time there was he'd made himself into the whole of the reason a road existed there at all. He'd married late, buried his wife young, and raised the girl on the riverbank with a pole in her hands, and when the pleurisy took him the winter before, it took him owing money to the bank in Camino. Money he'd borrowed to raise the ferry deck after the big flood, money he'd have paid back in tolls if the paying back hadn't wanted more summers than he had left. The note had gone to the bank, and the bank had sold it, and the man who bought it was Ezra Halloran. I met Halloran on the 3rd morning. He came out from Camino in a good buggy with a good horse and a good coat he didn't need in that heat, and he had 2 men riding easy behind him, and he pulled up at the fork under the crooked sign like a man who has already measured a place for his own furniture. He was not a big man. He had a soft, pleasant, unhurried face, and that is the kind of man you want to watch, because the loud ones only take your money and the soft ones take everything and thank you for it. Miss Hale, he said, touching his hat. I did hope you'd have thought better of things. I've thought about them plenty, Mr. Halloran. Then you'll know the sale stands for the 4th of the month. He looked past her at the house, at the barn, at me by the forge, and his gaze went over me and moved on the way a man's does over a fence post. It grieves me, it truly does. Your father was a fine old fellow, but the crossing's more than a woman can keep, and I've a mind to put a proper toll bridge in pilings, timber, a thing that'll last, and when I do, this ferry and this scrape of land won't be worth the taxes. I'm offering you a kindness, buying now. You'll want to take it before the kindness runs thin. It's not for sale. It's already sold, he said, gentle as milk. You're only quibbling over whether you walk off it with a little money or none. He gathered his reins. The 4th, Miss Hale, have your things in a wagon. He touched his hat again and turned the buggy, and one of his men, going by, let his eyes rest on Nora a beat too long, the way a man does when he's been told a thing is about to be nobody's, and I set down the rasp I was holding and stood up off the anvil, and the man read something in that and looked away and rode on. Halloran never so much as glanced back. When the dust of them had gone, Nora stood a while looking at the road, and I saw her hands were shaking, and I saw her make them stop. How much is the note? I said. That's not your concern. How much? She told me, because I think she was too tired that morning to keep telling me it wasn't my concern. It was more money than I had ever held at one time in my life, but it was not so much money that a working crossing couldn't have paid it down over a few good seasons, if the crossing had 2 hands to work it and nobody circling it waiting for it to fall. Alone, in a bad water summer, with a man like Halloran letting the fear do half his work for him, she was going to lose it, and she knew she was going to lose it, and the knowing was the thing that had put the shake in her hands. I want to tell you, I did the arithmetic that morning and made a cold decision. The truth is homelier than that. The truth is I had shod my horse and had no more reason to stay, and I stood in her barnyard with my saddle over my shoulder, and could not make my feet carry me to the horse. because, for the first time in 2 running years, I had found a thing I did not want to be moving away from, and it took me the better part of a day sitting on an upturned bucket by the forge to understand that the thing was not the crossing. It was her, the square set of her against the whole weight of it, a woman standing alone on a shrinking piece of ground and refusing, plainly and without any drama in it at all, to be moved. I had spent my life among men who ran. I was the worst of them, and here was somebody who wouldn't. So that evening, when she came out to shut the barn, I said the thing that changed both our lives, and I said it as clumsy as any man ever said such a thing. "Marry me," I said. She went still. Then she laughed short and hard without any humor in it. "Get on your horse, Mr. Callum. Hear me out, and then I will if you say so." I stood up off the bucket. My hat was in my hands. I don't remember taking it off. You need 2 things Halloran's counting on you not having: a worker and a name. A married crossing with a man's back in it that pays its tolls and pays down its note is a business. A woman alone is a thing waiting to be taken. I've drove cattle 20 years, and I can pole a ferry and swing a hammer and stand in a doorway looking unfriendly, which is half of what you need. Marry me on paper and I'll work this crossing, and we'll pay Halloran's note down till it's gone and he can build his bridge somewhere else. I'll not ask a thing of you that a hired man wouldn't get. Your house is your house. I'll sleep in the barn. It's a bargain is all. Same as buying a mule, except the mule signs the book. She looked at me a long time in the last of the light. I have been looked at by trail bosses trying to decide if I'd hold up under a stampede, and by card players trying to decide if I was bluffing, and neither of those looks was half so thorough as the one Nora Hale gave me across her barnyard that evening. "Why," she said at last, "a man doesn't tie himself to another man's debt and another man's crossing for the wages of a hired hand. Why?" And because she'd asked it straight, I owed her a straight answer, and I gave her more of one than I meant to. "Because I've got a brother down in the brush country running with men that'll get him hung," I said, "and every town I light in he finds me, and every time he finds me he's got a scheme that'll make us both rich and both dead, and I'm tired of being findable. A man rooted to a crossing on a river 6 miles from a nothing town is a man who can tell his brother no and mean it. You'd be doing me the favor as much as the other way round." I turned my hat in my hands. "And because I watched you bring that ferry across high water alone and land it like it was nothing, and I decided I'd rather spend my strength keeping a thing like you've got here standing than spend it moving cattle for men I don't respect. That's the whole of it. It's not pretty, and it's not a courtship. It's a bargain between 2 people who each need the one thing the other's got." She didn't answer for a while. The river talked in the dark below us. "Separate roofs," she said finally. "The barn's yours. You don't come in the house without I ask you." "Yes, ma'am." "You work when I say work, and you leave the running of the crossing to me. It's my father's crossing. It's mine. You're not the master of it. I never asked to be. And if you're the kind of man who says one thing in a barnyard and means another once his name's on the book," she said, very quiet, "I sleep with my father's shotgun, and I know how to use it, and I've got no more fear of a man than I have of high water." "I believe you," I said, and I did. We were married that Sunday by the circuit preacher in Camino, in a ceremony that took less time than shoeing a horse, with the livery man and his wife for witnesses, because we didn't have anybody else, and you need 2. Nora wore a clean gray dress and I wore a clean shirt, and when the preacher said the words we said them back, and I felt nothing you'd call romance and everything you'd call a door closing quiet behind me, which after 2 years of running was its own kind of grace. On the courthouse steps after, I filed the paper that made the crossing a married man's business in both our names, and I saw the clerk note it, and I thought, let Halloran hear that. Let it get back to him that Hale's crossing has a man in it now who paid 2 bits to be poled across and stayed. We rode back to the crossing in the wagon not speaking, and it was the most peaceful ride I'd had in years. That was the summer of the bargain. What neither of us knew yet was that a bargain, if you both keep it honest long enough, has a way of turning into something you never bargained for at all. A crossing is more work than it looks, and it looks like a great deal. The ferry rope wants tending, it stretches and frays and has to be spliced and tarred, and the deck timbers rot from the underside where you can't see, and the ramps silt over after every rise and want digging out. The barn roof I mentioned. The garden. The stock. She kept a milk cow and pigs and a mean rooster and a dozen hens that laid where they pleased. And the crossing itself, which in a dry spell is easy and in a wet one will kill you. Freighters and drovers and families in wagons and men on horses, and once that whole first month, a troupe of actors with a painted wagon who paid in a song, because they had no coin, and Nora took the song because she was, under the gray dress and the square shoulders, a woman who had been raised alone on a riverbank and had a soft place for anybody else who lived by whatever the road brought them. I learned all of it that summer, and I learned it from her, because she knew every plank and every eddy and I knew none of it. And there is a particular thing that happens to two people when one of them teaches the other how to keep the thing they both depend on alive. You can't stay strangers through it. You try, we both tried, God knows. We were both people who'd learned that strangers were safer, but you cannot pole a ferry across high water with someone 40 times and stay strangers. The water won't let you. There's a moment, every crossing, when the current takes hold and the deck bucks and you both put your weight on the pole and the rope together. And in that moment you are not two people with a paper between you. You are four hands doing one thing. And after enough of those moments, the paper starts to seem like a small and foolish way to describe what you've got. The change came slow, and I couldn't tell you the day of it, but I can tell you the pieces. I can tell you that the first week she left my supper on the porch rail and I ate it in the barn, and by the third week she'd taken to setting 2 plates in the dog trot, in the open air, with the river below us, because it was foolish, she said, to dirty 2 fires. And I can tell you that we ate a great many suppers in that dog trot before either of us admitted we'd started looking forward to them. I can tell you she found out I couldn't read past my own name. My father hadn't held with schooling and there'd been no time for it after. And instead of pitying me, she got out her father's Bible and a stub of pencil and started me on it after supper, plainly, the way she taught everything, as a job to be done. And I have never in my life worked harder at anything than I worked at not being a man who couldn't read in front of Nora Hale. By first frost, I could get through a psalm slow. She never once made me feel small over it. That's a thing I've carried. A hard woman is easy to find. A woman that hard who is that kind under it is the rarest thing there is, and I had married one on a bargain, like a fool who buys a plot of scrub and strikes water. I can tell you about the fever, too. In the wet part of the fall she took a chill off the river and it went down into her chest the way it had gone into her father's. And for 3 days and nights I did the crossing alone and nursed her between. And on the worst night, when the fever had her talking to her dead father like he was in the room, I sat by her bed in the house. She told me never to enter without asking, and I held her hand and I asked her father, out loud like a fool, not to take her, because I hadn't got to tell her yet. I don't know if she heard it. She never said. But the fever broke toward dawn, and when she woke and found me there in her house, her hand in mine, she didn't reach for the shotgun. She looked at me a long moment out of a gray, tired face, and she said, "You did the crossing alone." "I did." "You didn't drown anybody." "No, ma'am." And she almost smiled and shut her eyes and slept, and I sat there till the light came all the way up, and somewhere in that night the bargain had become a marriage and neither of us had said a word about it. We were careful after. We were 2 proud people and we'd both been hurt into hardness young, and neither of us knew how to say a soft thing without feeling like we'd handed the other a weapon. But it was in the small things. She started calling me Wade instead of Mr. Callum. I built her a proper bench for the dog trot so we didn't eat off the rail. She sewed the tear in my coat without being asked and left it folded on the barn door where I'd find it, and I understood the coat the way I'd never understood any words. We paid down Halloran's note. a little the first month, more the next, because two working the crossing was 3 times the crossing one could work, and every dollar that went to Camino toward that note was a dollar of Ezra Halloran's certainty spent, and I took a low satisfaction in it I'm not ashamed of. Halloran came out twice more that fall. The first time he was still soft and sure, and he offered again to buy us out, and Nora let me stand in the doorway and answer him, and I told him the crossing was married and paying its note and building its trade, and that he could build his bridge in the river and watch it wash out, and he smiled his milk smile and went away. The second time he was not so soft. Somebody had let it slip to him, or he'd worked it out, that a paid-down note doesn't foreclose, and that a man like me in the doorway meant his easy taking had turned into a hard buying, and hard buying was more than the crossing was worth to him against a woman he'd counted on frightening off in a season. He sat his buggy and looked at the two of us, and there was nothing soft in the look at all. "You've cost me a bridge, Callum," he said. "You'll get over it. A man does what he can with what he's got," he said, which is a thing that sounds like nothing and is, if you've lived among men who mean it, a threat. And he turned the buggy and went, and I watched the dust of him all the way to the bend, and something in me that had spent 20 years reading trouble on the trail stood up and started paying attention. Because a soft man who's lost the easy way to a thing he wants doesn't stop wanting it. He just starts looking for a harder way. And a harder way, out where we were, on a river 6 miles from the law, generally has a name, and the name is generally the kind of men my brother rode with. I should have seen the whole of it then. But I was a newly and secretly married man in a home I'd stumbled into, learning to read by lamplight next to a woman I'd have died for and hadn't found the words to tell, and I let myself believe, for a few good weeks, that a man could close the door on his old life just by refusing to open it. Then, on a cold, bright morning near the turn of the year, my brother Levi rode up out of the brush on the Camino road, grinning like the boy he'd been, with 3 hard men behind him I'd never seen, and I understood that I had not closed any door at all. I'd only been standing in front of it, and Levi had found the crossing, the way Levi always found me, and this time the wrong crowd had ridden in with him. I have to tell you about Levi, and I have to tell you fair, because it would be easy to make him the villain of this, and he wasn't. He was my brother. He was 6 years younger than me, and I had half raised him, our mother gone before he had a memory of her, and our father a hard man with a bottle who was more absent than not. And everything soft that ever came into Levi's childhood came from me, and everything hard came from the world. And I have spent a long time understanding that a boy raised on those 2 things grows up loving whoever loves him and unable, for the life of him, to tell the difference between a man who loves him and a man who's only got a use for him. That was Levi's whole trouble in a sentence. He'd follow anybody who'd tell him he was somebody. And the men who tell a rootless young man he's somebody, out in that country, are never the men you'd want telling him. He got down off his horse in the barnyard and threw his arms around me, and I hugged him back, because he was my brother and I loved him and hadn't seen him in 8 months. And over his shoulder, I looked at the 3 men still mounted, and I knew them for what they were, the way you know a rattler for what it is before you can name the markings. The leader was a lean, still man with pale eyes who sat his horse like he'd never once in his life been in a hurry, and Levi, pulling back, grinning, said, "Wade, this here's Rafe Doss. I've been telling him about you." And I knew the name. Anybody who'd worked cattle in that country in those years knew the name Doss. Doss ran off other men's beef and other men's horses, and, it was said, other men's lives when they got in the way, and he did it with a patience and a cruelty that made him worse than the loud outlaws, because you couldn't hear him coming. "Callum," Doss said, and touched his hat, mild as a deacon. "Your brother speaks high of you, says you was the best drover in 3 counties before you took up ferry work." His pale eyes went over the crossing, the ferry, the barn, the road, and I watched him price it the way Halloran had priced it, and a cold thing settled in my stomach, because now I knew what the harder way was going to look like. "We're just passing," Levi said, "too quick, too bright. Das has got a thing up north, a big thing, Wade, and we're moving stock down the Camino Road and the Sablon's the only crossing for 40 miles. And I said, hell, my own brother runs it. We'll cross free and Wade'll never say a word. One Callum to another." "How much stock?" I said. Levi's grin flickered. "Does it matter?" "How much, Levi, and whose?" And there it was, out in the cold morning between us, the whole of it. The thing I'd married a crossing to get away from, and it had ridden up my own road grinning with my own brother's face on it. Das watched me with those pale, patient eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing, bringing Levi. He was a man who used what he had, and what he had was that I loved my brother, and he meant to run a couple hundred head of stolen cattle across the one crossing in 40 miles right under the nose of a man who'd never turn in his own kin. I want to tell you I threw them off the place. I didn't not that first morning, because Nora came out onto the porch behind me with her father's shotgun broke over her arm, casual as you please, and the three riders shifted, and Levi looked from her to me with his mouth open, and I understood that if I said the wrong word right then there'd be gunplay in my own barnyard with my brother in the middle of it, and I was not going to let Levi die in Nora's dooryard over Rafe Das's cattle. "You'll not cross today," I said. "River's up. Come back in a week when it's down and we'll talk." Which was a lie about the river, and we both knew it, and Das let me have the lie, because a patient man is happy to wait a week, and he touched his hat again and reined around, and Levi hung back a moment, hurt and confused, and said low, just to me, "Wade, come on. It's me. Since when do you turn me off with the strangers?" "Since you started riding with the man who's going to get you hung," I said just as low. "Come inside, Levi, leave them. Stay here, work the crossing with me. I'll teach you the ferry wheel." But he was already backing toward his horse, his face gone to the boy's face that always came up when I tried to be his father instead of his friend, hurt and stubborn. And he swung up and said, "You always did think you was better," and rode off after Das. And I stood in the cold with my heart going out of my chest down the Camino Road after him, the way it had gone after him our whole lives. Nora closed the shotgun with a soft double click behind me. "That your brother?" she said. "That's my brother. And the pale one's the trouble you married my crossing to get shut of." "Yes." She was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing I have loved her for more than any soft word she ever gave me, because it wasn't soft, it was true, and it was hers, and it cost her. "Then we'll shut of it together," she said. "It's my crossing and you're my husband, and no man rides stolen beef across Hale's Crossing while I'm standing on it. But Wade." She waited until I looked at her. "That's your brother. We'll do it in a way that leaves him a road out. I won't have you save this place and lose him and call it a fair trade. There's no such thing as a fair trade that costs a man his brother. We find the way that saves both, or we don't do it." I had not, in 34 years, had anybody offer to carry a weight of mine that they didn't have to carry. I'd carried Levi alone my whole life. And here was a woman I'd married on a bargain, standing in a cold dooryard with her father's gun, telling me my brother was our trouble now, and we'd find the road that saved him. I didn't have the words. I've told you I never had the words. But I crossed the porch and I took her face in my two hands, careful, the way you'd cup water you were dying for, and I kissed her, and she let me. And after a moment she kissed me back, and it was the first time in the whole of it, and there was nothing of a bargain left anywhere in it at all. "That took you long enough," she said against my mouth, and I felt her almost smile, and I understood that she had been waiting on me, proud and patient, this whole while. We had that day and part of that night, the two of us, married at last in the true way as well as the paper way, before the trouble came down on us. I've always been grateful for it. Whatever a man's owed in this life, I got that one day free and clear, and I've never once thought it wasn't worth everything that came after. I knew Das wouldn't wait the week. A patient man is patient right up until he decides you've had enough time to see reason, and then he moves fast and all at once, and I'd read something in those pale eyes that told me he'd give me maybe 2 nights before he tried the crossing whether I willed it or not, probably at night, probably with the cattle, probably counting on me to fold rather than fight with Levi in the saddle. So I didn't wait either. I rode to Camino the next morning, and I did the hardest thing I did in the whole of it, harder than the wedding, harder than what came at the river. I found the county man. There was a deputy kept in office there, a tired, honest fellow named Prentice who'd known Amos Hale and had no love for cattle thieves. And I sat down across his desk, and I told him that Rafe Doss meant to move stolen stock across Hale's crossing within a day or two, and that if he'd have men there, we could take Doss with the beef under him and the brands to prove it, and end the man in that country for good. Prentice looked at me a while. Doss rides with a boy named of Callum, he said. Same as you. My brother. You'd turn in your own brother. I'd take Doss, I said, and I'd have my brother alive to hang the man that used him if you'll deal me one card. If Levi comes off with the cattle, if he's clear of the shooting, you take him easy and you charge him light riding with them, not the theft, not the killing, and I'll swear he was led, which is God's truth, and he'll do a short stretch and come out young enough to make a life. That's my one card. Doss and the whole crew for a light hand on the boy. You'll never get a better offer for a man like Doss, and you know it. Prentice chewed on it. He was an honest man, and honest men will make that deal, because they'd rather have the wolf than the pup, and because he'd known Amos Hale, and I think there was some old debt of feeling in it too. He made the deal. It was more than the law owed me and less than I wanted, and it was the only road I could see that ran through the middle and left my brother standing at the end of it. Then I rode home and told Nora, and she heard me out, and when I was done she took my hand across the supper bench and held it, which for Nora was a speech. It's the right road, she said. It'll break your heart to walk it, and it's still the right one. He'll hate you a while. I know. He'll come round. Men do when they're young enough and somebody loved them true enough. You loved him true. That's the thing that'll bring him back, not this week, not next year, but it'll bring him. She squeezed my hand. You raised a boy that's worth saving, Wade, or you wouldn't be tearing yourself in half to save him. Remember that when you're hating yourself over it. The wolf you can hang clean. It's only the ones worth saving that ever tear you up. They came the second night, just as I'd read it. I'd had 2 of Prentice's men in the barn since dark, and Prentice himself, and 2 more down in the willows below the ramp, and Nora up in the house with the shotgun and lamp trimmed low, and me on the porch in the cold with my father's old pistol I'd hardly ever fired, waiting, listening to the river talk in the dark. Toward the small hours I heard them. You don't hear a herd so much as feel it, a low trembling in the ground that comes up before the sound does, and then the cattle came out of the brush along the Camino road, a couple hundred head moving quiet the way stolen beef moves, pushed by riders who'd learned to work stock without a sound. And Doss was at the point of them on his pale-sitting horse, and Levi was on the flank, and the other men strung out behind, and they came down toward the crossing in the starlight expecting a folded, frightened man and a woman who'd stand aside. I stepped off the porch into the road where they could see me, and I called out, and I called to my brother first, because whatever else that night was, I wanted the last clean thing in it to be that I'd called to Levi before I called to the law. Levi, I shouted, ride off now, boy, hard as you can, and don't look back. The law's here for Doss, and you're not in it if you ride now, Levi Gio. For one breath everything hung. Levi's face turned to me, pale in the starlight, and I saw the boy in it. I saw him understand. I saw him look from me to Doss and back. The whole of his life caught in that one turn of his head, follow the man who'd told him he was somebody, or trust the brother who'd raised him. And Rafe Doss, patient no more, drew and fired at me. I won't dress up the next part, and I won't make it bloody either, because it was over almost before it started, the way those things are. Doss's shot went past me, and Prentice's men rose up out of the dark in the willows, and it was done in less time than it takes to tell. A scatter of shots, cattle breaking and bawling, riders throwing up their hands or trying to run and pulled down. 2 of Das's men gave up when they saw the guns. 1 didn't and was hurt and lived. And Das himself, caught flat with the law all around him and his easy patient plan blown to the wind, spun his horse to run and rode straight into Prentiss coming up from the willows. And there was a short, ugly moment I'll not describe. And at the end of it, Rafe, Das was down and taken and finished in that country for good, alive to hang, which is what an honest deputy would rather have. And Levi had ridden off. He'd gone at my shout. That's the thing I've held onto through all the years since. When it came down to the one turn of his head, my brother chose me. He wheeled his horse at my shout and rode off into the dark before the first gun rose, away from Das, away from the cattle, out toward the open country and Prentiss's men who'd been told let him go. I found him 3 days later, because I knew where a Callum goes to ground when he's scared and ashamed. And it's always up high with water below him, because that's where our father used to take us the rare times he was sober and gentle. And Levi had gone up onto the bluff above the Sablon 2 miles north of the crossing and made a cold camp, and was sitting there staring at the river like a boy who's done a thing he can't undo, which he hadn't, but didn't know it yet. He heard my horse and didn't turn. "You turned them in," he said. "I turned Das in. You I called off. There's a difference, and you knew it in the dark or you'd not have run at my shout." He was quiet a long while. The river talked below us the way it always did. "Prentiss'll take me," he said. "For riding with them." "He will, and it'll be light because I asked him light and swore you were led, which is the truth. You'll do a short stretch, Levi, 2 years, maybe less, and you'll come out young." I got down off my horse and I went and sat next to my brother on the cold bluff above the river the way we'd sat as boys, and I put my arm around him. And after a while he leaned into it the way he had when he was small and the world was too big, and I felt him shaking, and it wasn't the cold. "I didn't know how to say no to him," he said into my coat. "He made me feel like I was worth something, Wade. You always tried to make me be better. He just told me I already was. And it was a lie, but it felt so much better than being better." "I know," I said. "I know it did. It's the oldest lie there is, and it snags the best hearts. That's why it's dangerous, Levi. It only works on the ones worth saving." I held him. "I'm going to be there when you come out. You hear me? There's a crossing on the Sablon with your name, a Callum, on the deed of it right alongside mine, if you want it. And a woman there tougher than either of us who says a man that's worth his brother tearing himself in half over is a man worth a place at her supper bench. You've got a home to come out to. You never had that before, you do now. That's the difference between me and Das, boy. He had a use for you, and I've got a place for you. And a place is the thing that'll still be there in 2 years when the use is long hanged." He turned in prison in Camino for a light stretch. And I want to say plainly that I do not know, sitting here, whether every man in his place would come out mended. Some don't. But Levi did, and I've thought a lot about why, and the best I can figure is that it's the difference between a man who goes into that stretch with nothing waiting and a man who goes in with a home on the other side of it and a brother who'll be at the gate. He had somewhere to come back to. Nora and I saw to it he knew that every month a letter I wrote in my own slow hand that she helped me spell, so that the reading of it, my hand getting steadier down the page, told him a thing the words alone couldn't, which was that his brother was still becoming a better man on the outside, still had the door open, still meant it. He came out young like I'd promised, and he came to the crossing and he stayed. Ezra Halloran built his bridge in the end. Not at our crossing. He never got our crossing, but 4 miles up the river, a fine long timber toll bridge, and for a season or 2 I thought it might sink us, a bridge against a ferry, and I lay awake over it more than one night. But a bridge is a fixed thing and a river is not. And the second spring after, the Sablon came up bigger than any flood in Amos Hale's 30 years, and it took Halloran's fine pilings out from under his fine bridge like a man kicking the legs from a stool. And it left our old ferry, which gives when the water shoves and rides the shove instead of fighting it, sitting fat and whole on its cable, ready to carry every traveler on that road for the 2 years it took him to rebuild. We paid off Amos Hale's note that summer with the toll of Ezra Halloran's ruined ambition, and I have never enjoyed a debt paid the way I enjoyed that one, and I'll answer for the sin of it to whoever keeps the books up above. Nora and I never did have children of our own, though we hoped for them a while and grieved a little that they didn't come. But a crossing on a road is never short of children, the families that camp overnight waiting for the water to drop, the orphans the road throws up that stay a season and move on, and Levi's in time, 3 of them who called Nora aunt and me uncle and grew up on that riverbank with a pole in their hands the way she had, so that the crossing was never once quiet and never once hours alone, and I came to understand that a home is not the people you make, it's the people you keep. And we kept a great many. I'm an old man now. Nora's gone 3 winters, she went easy, in the house she was born in, with my hand in hers, and her last clear word to me was to see that the ferry rope got its spring tarring, which is the most Nora thing she could possibly have said, and I have laughed and wept over it in about equal measure ever since. Levi runs the crossing now with his eldest boy, and they let me sit in the dog trot on the bench I built 40 years ago and watch the water and pretend I'm still useful. And every so often a stranger crosses and asks the old man on the porch how a drover came to own a ferry, and I tell them the same thing I've told you. I paid 2 bits to be poled across a river by a woman who didn't want me there, and I offered to marry her to save her father's crossing, and I told her it was a bargain, same as buying a mule. And it was the best trade I ever made, and the last honest running I ever did. And if a young man ever asks me, they do, sometimes, what the difference is between the men who'll ruin you and the men who'll save you, I tell him it's the plainest thing in the world once you've lived long enough to see it, and the hardest to believe when you're young and hungry to be somebody. A man with a use for you will tell you you're already worth everything. A man with a place for you will just quietly hold the door and pole you across and put a plate on the bench and wait however long it takes, through high water and low, for you to come home. I married the second kind by accident and became one on purpose, and it took me the better part of my life to know which was the greater luck. Nora knew from the start, I think. She always did see the water clearer than me. The rope once tarring, she was right about that too,